I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Katie Cambron. And I look, in my brain, I was like, please do not murder the last name again. But she is the Medical Science Liaison for Amgen. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can you guys all hear me? Is this working? Yes? Okay, excellent. There we go. So thank you for the introduction. Like she said, I am a medical science liaison at Amgen, which basically means I am quote unquote field-based. So I'm based here in North Carolina. I cover North and South Carolina. I am not a sales rep though. I am on the medical side. So my job is to keep oncologists in the community locally connected to our data and our clinical trials and things that are coming onto the market. And so as such, I'm going to give a talk today on understanding how new drug treatments and all the steps that have to kind of take place in order to get something onto the market. I know we've talked a lot about clinical trials today, and I've been sitting in the back thinking, oh, I wish I'd been earlier and given this kind of as a background, but that's okay. We'll catch everybody up. I am a clinical pharmacist by training, and so it was kind of a natural transition after I worked. Is it cutting out? Outpatient infusion oncology clinic for several years before making the jump over to the industry and being more involved with research. So an overview of what I'll be talking about today. We're going to talk about the drug development process and what steps are taken to analyze the data from clinical trials. Some things we should consider when we're comparing between clinical trials of two different medicines. And then after that, you may be wondering how to get involved. And so we'll talk about what you need to think about if you're interested in potentially enrolling in a clinical trial. And then I have just one brief overview slide of Amgen's current clinical trials in small cell lung cancer. And so before a drug can be kind of widely available, to anybody who goes into their oncologist's office, there's a pretty extensive process that has to take place first. And we'll go into a lot more detail, but it really starts with drug discovery and development down there in step one. And we'll talk also in more detail about both preclinical, so before it gets into actual patients and humans, preclinical research that takes place, clinical research, and then before it goes, all of that data goes to the FDA for review before it gets approved and eligible for any post-marketing monitoring. But before we kind of get into the details of the process, I really love this chart. It's a little bit hard to see up there, but it's almost a timeline of what has to happen. And the funnel there that's kind of in whitish in the middle represents, I've got a pointer. So this part right here represents the number of molecules that are going to be potential new drugs. So at the beginning of the process in drug discovery, we've got thousands or tens of thousands of potential candidates for what will eventually become a drug on the market. And each step in the process kind of weeds out the ones that maybe don't work as well as we think they're going to work, or maybe don't have the safety profile that we're looking for that are going to be appropriate for patients. And so over a number of years, the median number of years that it takes from a drug to go from discovery to being on the market is 7 years, and costs upwards of over $600 million because there's so many different studies and so much research that has to go on. But it eventually gets whittled down until you get one medicine that makes it onto the market. And just for your reference, when you kind of think about the scale of things, so in the 6 year, did I do that math right? In the period from May of 2016 to May of 2021, there were 207 new medicines, specifically in hematology and oncology, that got approved by the FDA. And so the first part, the part that people, and especially me as a clinical pharmacist kind of before I got this job, the part that people are the least familiar with are really the drug discovery and the preclinical research process. And so drug discovery, you don't just go out and find molecules and say, hey, I wonder if this works in cancer. You really start Amgen always talks about biology first. So we understand the underlying processes with the disease, in this case, obviously cancer and oncology. And once you understand the underlying kind of processes that are happening on the microscopic, the cellular level, you can start to think of what might be something that's good to target, either from a drug that might disrupt a process that drives a cancer, or we've talked a lot about immuno-oncology and things that are going to help bring the immune system to your cancer. So once we've identified our target, then a drug can start to be developed that actually targets the target or, helps harness the immune system there. And so once those, the final candidates for these potential new drugs are identified, we start to undergo preclinical research. So what does that consist of? So it starts with laboratory research. So we'll have tumor cells in a test tube that will test these potential drugs on to see if it actually makes them stop growing, things of that nature. Start to understand some of the initial characteristics of the medicines before they move into animal models. I know that somebody mentioned mouse models earlier, so that's a very common one that's used early on. And so, will mice or other animal models who have these tumors, do they respond? You start to understand an idea of potential side effects and toxicities that could occur in these animals before they even go into humans. And it starts to, although it's in a vastly different size scale, you start to get an idea of a potentially appropriate dose per the body size of your animal model and how you might translate that and kind of scale it up into humans. And that's all before it even gets tested in the first patient. And so then we move into clinical research, which is probably what folks are most familiar with. I know the presentation earlier referenced the 3 different phases of drug development or clinical trials that happen before a drug is approved, starting with phase 1. And so the goal of phase 1 is to establish the safety and the dosage. And so this is going to be the first time that these medicines have ever been tested in a human. And so the doses are started really, really low because you don't want to, come in guns blazing and cause all sorts of problems for the patients. And so each patient subsequently in the first in human gets a higher and higher dose. So the dose isn't increased in one individual patient to see what they can tolerate. Whatever dose it starts with in a particular patient is the dose that patient gets throughout their treatment. And then once it's established to be safe in that patient, then additional patients can get it at a higher dose, on and on until we reach what's known as, the maximum tolerated dose, which is typically the one that moves forward into phase 2 development. And so for the first phase in this dose, it's often referred to as dose escalation. This can take several months to upwards of 3 years. Phase 2, you're starting to look at larger studies, but the goal of these studies are really to start looking at effectiveness as well as the safety. So we have an idea of what the safety profile will be, but now we're starting to really hone in on, is it actually going to be effective in the way that we think it's going to be? In phase 2, sometimes you can go back, and it's becoming a lot more common now, you can get some dose optimization. One of the FDA's newest goals is really, instead of the maximum tolerated dose, which was kind of the way that chemotherapy was developed, how high can we push these doses and keep it safe for the patient so we can maximize cancer killing? With a lot of our newer targeted therapies, that's not necessarily the approach that you have to take. And so in phase 2, they'll kind of optimize and go back and find what the minimal efficacious dose is. And so just making sure that we're not pushing the dose higher than we need to make it as safe as possible while also getting the results that we want in terms of it being effective against the cancer. These phase 2 studies, again, they're also going to take either several months to up to 3 years. And those, both phase 1 and phase 2 studies are often referred to as single-arm studies. And so these will be studies where you know that you're getting the experimental treatment. There's not going to be another potential study arm where you might be randomized to something else most of the time in these earlier phase studies. But phase 3 is really where you start to get the comparisons to standard of care. So these are really larger scale studies, hopefully hundreds and hundreds of patients in oncology and other diseases. Blood pressure medicines, they have tens of thousands of patients in their studies, but oncology is much smaller, and so our clinical trials tend to be smaller. But this is where you're really going back and comparing it to whatever the standard of care is, because that's really the only way to prove that the new treatment is potentially better than what's currently out there. Phase 3 studies also tend to take a long time, potentially even longer than the earlier phase studies, 1 to over 4 years. So you can see even when you're just talking about the clinical research stage, it can take years for drugs to eventually make it to the eventual FDA approval. But the clinical research doesn't stop with FDA approval. You've got phase 4 studies where you're looking at monitoring studies after the drugs are approved. And there are also studies, like in Dr. Sand's talk earlier, talking about lurbinectedin and looking at it in new combinations and things of that nature. We're always looking at different drugs in new combinations and new settings. Something may initially be studied in later line cancer, and you're gradually going to hope to move it to earlier lines of therapy to help people earlier in their treatment journey. So there's always ongoing research. It doesn't stop once the drug is FDA approved. But all of that talk about how long it takes for medicines to get onto the market, when you have something like cancer that is can be so deadly and so dangerous to a lot of patients, we really want to be able to get medicines onto the market as quickly and safely as possible. And so there are several avenues through the FDA's review process that can make medications available more quickly than they would be if they underwent kind of the standard review process. Drugs can get a fast track designation, which does exactly what it sounds like. It really speeds up drug development and leads to faster approval for more serious conditions, again, like cancer. For medicines whose early results start to look like they are showing really dramatic benefits over the standard of care, over existing therapies, they can be given a breakthrough therapy designation, which again is another ticket to getting them on a faster FDA review process. There's also, you may have heard of medicines receiving accelerated approval before they get full approval. And so for serious conditions, again, like cancer, the FDA can grant things accelerated approval based off of these earlier phase 1 or phase 2 studies without them being directly compared to the standard of care in a randomized fashion. Their approval will then be contingent upon the completion of the randomized phase 3 study, so it doesn't eliminate the possibility or the requirement for them to be compared to the standard of care, but it does enable patients to have access to medications sooner than they would have instead of waiting those additional 4 years if it looks like there's going to be a substantial benefit. And then there's also a priority review designation. The standard review timeline, once you have your kind of packet of data for the FDA, the standard amount of time that the FDA tells you is that it'll take them 10 months to review. But if it's a condition that is serious and they feel like they need to take faster action, they can give a priority review, which will enable approval to be given in 6 months or faster instead of 10 months. And so this is just an example timeline of a medicine that went through kind of a really accelerated review process. And so the first in human clinical trials started around the middle of 2018. And you can see the top line here is the timeline for the phase 1/2 study. And the actual FDA approval of this medicine occurred in mid-2021, so only 3 years after the first patient was dosed with the medication. This was obviously prior to, so the phase 3 study was started in 2020 and it was not finished in 2021, unfortunately. So the drug made it onto the market before the completion of that, but the FDA does give, a timeline for when they would expect to see those randomized results to give the full FDA approval. And it's also got flagged on here the FDA kind of designations that permitted this quick review process. This particular medication would have received breakthrough therapy designation and then received a priority review. And this particular priority review, I know I mentioned 6 months, but this one, the priority review was granted in February and then it was approved in May. So it can happen even faster. So once all of the research is completed, all of the preclinical studies and the clinical trials are done, how does the FDA make their decision? And so all of this data is submitted as through a marketing application, and the FDA review process isn't a bunch of bureaucrats sitting around. They've really got experts. So they have doctors who are experts in clinical care, statisticians that are experts in study design and actual data analysis. They've also got chemists and pharmacologists and other scientists that are going to be reviewing the preclinical data that is part of the submission packet. So it's not just the clinical data that they're looking at when they make their decisions. The FDA can also convene an advisory board, basically of physicians who practice in the real world who are not employed by the FDA. So they'll get a group of oncologists together to review the data, and those folks will vote and give their opinion to the FDA. The FDA isn't necessarily required to follow their recommendations, but they often do. So the FDA, once everybody's been consulted and given their opinion, they'll give an up or down vote, so either approve or not approve, or they could kind of kick the can down the road and ask for additional data if they feel that, what's been conducted so far is not sufficient for them to make the decision of whether it's a safe and effective therapy. They may ask for additional studies to be completed before they approve the medicine. But then ultimately, like I said, they're going to weigh the benefits and the risks before making their marketing approval decision. And so once, you've got a disease where there are multiple new medications, there are lots of new medications coming out at one time, how do you compare clinical trials? The ideal way to compare two treatments is to have them in a single clinical trial, like I mentioned with phase 3. Patients will be randomly assigned to one or the other, which is really going to ensure, I know it could be frustrating as a patient to not have a choice in what you're getting, and if it's a blinded study, you may not even know which treatment that you're getting. But that really is the only way to ensure that there's balance between the two treatment arms, is to randomly decide, okay, this person gets one and this person gets the other. It prevents, all the sick patients from getting the newer treatment, and then all the patients who are doing well, getting the standard of care, or vice versa. But without that randomization, you can't really compare. And the hard thing with new medicines is often that you'll have, drug A compared to a standard chemotherapy regimen, and then drug B compared to a standard chemotherapy regimen. But you're not going to have drug A and drug B compared to each other directly. And of course, everybody is still going to make, whenever you go to a medical conference and they say they're about to make a cross-trial comparison, they always talk about how you should never make cross-trial comparisons. But people are going to inevitably, because that's the only thing that we have. But it's just important to keep in mind the fact that two different clinical trials may be extremely different. You have to look at the study design. So, how many cycles of chemotherapy did the patients in two different studies get? The patient populations may be entirely different. You may have one study where the patients are incredibly sick, and the other study where, it's their first treatment for their cancer, and so they may be doing a lot better. And so it's tough to compare those apples to apples. But folks still do, so I think it's something that oncologists do all the time, probably, but it's just important to bear in mind that there are always going to be differences in clinical trials before comparing them directly. So after all of this, maybe you're thinking about participating in the clinical trial. So I've got a slide here with pros and cons, benefits and risks of participating in clinical trials. The big obvious benefit that there really isn't a downside to is by participating in a clinical trial, it's always going to advance our knowledge of new potential treatments and where the field of medicine is going. And there's a chance, on the pro side, that you as an individual patient may get access to something that's going to be the next big thing, the next breakthrough, earlier than somebody who is waiting for it, or who may not be able to get it through a clinical trial. The downside to that, though, and thinking back to that earlier slide, is the fact that not all medicines that are in clinical trials work out the way that we think that they will. There's always a chance, even if it gets an accelerated approval, after phase 2 and it looks really promising, when you actually go back and randomize it and compare it to standard of care in a single clinical trial, that it doesn't have the benefit that we think it's going to have. So there's always that risk, before we get all of the clinical data in place, that it may not work the way that we think that it will. There's also the risk for unknown side effects. Before all of the research is completed and before it's even broadly available to the general population, there are always rare side effects that are not going to be picked up in clinical trials or in earlier phase studies that you may start to see or you may experience if you're participating in a clinical trial. But clinical trials, like I said, it always benefits the research community. You may get something earlier than you would have otherwise, and it can help people feel more in control of their treatment and increase their treatment options to have something beyond just what's considered the current standard of care. Another factor to think about that I know that at least one other person's talked about today is time spent with your healthcare team. For some folks, that's going to be a pro. You get a lot more monitoring visits, get a lot more attention, a lot more time in the oncologist's office. But again, for a lot of folks, that's going to be a negative. For people that are driving 3 or 4 hours, or even if you're not driving that great distance, but you're still trying to work, having to get off work, or have a caregiver provide transportation for you to these visits, it's definitely going to be a challenge. So it could go either way on the increased time with your healthcare team. And then I know we had a big conversation about this just a few minutes ago, but the cost is definitely something that could fall in either category. Hopefully, study sponsors do oftentimes provide coverage of costs, not just for the experimental medication or treatment, but for other aspects of care. But in the event that you're on a study that doesn't have everything necessarily covered, insurance may not always cover all of the additional treatments and things that come as a part of a clinical trial. So definitely pros and cons. I think everybody here would definitely encourage patients to consider participating in a clinical trial, but it may not be right for every single person, and there's no reason to feel guilty if it doesn't fit in with your treatment journey or with your lifestyle at any given time. But again, the most important thing about considering participating in a clinical trial is talking to your oncologist and your care team. Every decision is individualized. And so, obviously don't take my word for it that it's a great thing to do. You really have to think about where you are on your journey and your social situation as well. But all clinical trials, again, because they are new medications, we don't know everything that's going to happen as far as side effects and whether or not they work. So they are really closely monitored throughout. And if there are, major safety events that happen in a clinical trial, the clinical trial can be halted and stopped so that it can be fully evaluated before additional patients are treated. And so we're really, even though there's a lot unknown, the conduct of clinical trials is done in such a way that it ensures that, all patients are kept as safe as possible throughout. For additional information, I've got a couple links up there, both to the FDA has a place on their websites to talk about clinical trials, as well as the National Institute of Health, or NIH. And so what does Amgen have going on for small cell lung cancer? We actually have a good number of studies in our current portfolio right now. They're all part of the Delphi series. Again, we talked about all the different phases of clinical trials, phase 1 through 3. Not all of those are necessarily enrolling at this time. Some of them have completed their enrollment, but there definitely are opportunities. And so again, if it's something that you would consider participating in or that you would be interested in learning more about, I would recommend talking to your oncologist about it. And again, different phases of research and also different lines. So patients who have received 1 or more, 2 or more, no prior treatment, so earlier line, available across lines of therapy for small cell lung cancer. And with that, I am happy to take any questions that you guys have about drug development. That's fine.
Make it good. Yeah. Made it. What should I ask? No. Is there a hesitancy at all on behalf of patients about being involved in clinical trials? Is there still some unknowns on the patient's behalf that maybe they don't understand that they can be beneficial?
I am not seeing patients on a day-to-day basis, but I think I would anticipate so. It's from family members that I know who have been approached about clinical trials, there is this hesitancy of, I don't know what's going to happen, and for a randomized study, you don't get to choose what you're being treated with. So I think that in general, there probably is. I think there've been reference earlier to how short oncology visits are. And not just oncology, gosh, any doctor's office visit goes by so fast. There's only so much time to be able to sit down and really discuss it with the patient. So I think that can definitely, I think it's still a lingering challenge. All right, thanks.